Hey everybody. So I haven't done a book review in a while, and the reason why is because I've been, busy with school and work, and I've actually been reading this book I'm going to review for you today. And it's been a while, and it's just I was actually going to post this video the other day, didn't get around to it, so I apologize that it's long. This is posted later than planned, but I finally got around to it. This is my book review of Catching Fire. It is the second Hunger Games story. It's currently being made into a movie. It's going to come out in November of this year. But this is part two of the Hunger Games. And in this one, you guys, and by the way, if you haven't seen the Hunger Games movie or have read the first book, probably it's probably not the best idea to watch this video right now. But if you've read this book, if you're aware of the plot of the second story, feel free to stay tuned with me. I'm not trying to push anybody away who hasn't been exposed to Hunger Games yet, but it is highly advised to at least read or have seen the movie of the first Hunger Games story before continuing on with this video. That's something I just highly recommend to you, simply because I'm pretty much going to be speaking a foreign language here as I'm reviewing this book. I'm not going to try to spoil it, but I am going to talk about some pretty big things that happen in this book, basically things that are hard to say without saying what the book is. So I'm not going to try to spoil anything, but I am going to get into kind of the synopsis of the story without with me trying to be spoiler free, of course. So Catching Fire, guys, like I said, it's the second Hunger Games story. I'm repeating myself here, but um, it basically takes place right after the first story left off. Katniss and Peeta are huge celebrities. They're people are honoring their victory from the 74th annual Hunger Games. Um, but they find out that like I said, if you haven't seen the first Hunger Games story, you've been warned. But I am going to have to talk about that in order to explain this one. Um, so basically, because they didn't have an official victor at the end of the Hunger Games from the first story, it was a tiebreaker. It was both Peeta and Katniss, not just Katniss and not just Peeta. It was two winners this time, and it's the first thing that's ever happened. It's the first time that's ever happened in the Hunger Games event that's been around for this whole ever since the Capitol has been around in the U.S. in this story's timeline, and basically the Capitol viewed that as kind of their revolt against the Hunger Games. They didn't like the fact that there was two winners. They didn't like the fact that they were about to commit suicide just to kind of get what they wanted. So President Snow took that as an insult. President Snow he's kind of the runner of the Capitol. Um, so he gets together with Katniss and informs her. And this isn't spoiling too much. It's just a synopsis of the story. He informs her that what she did was very much against the Capitol's rules. That she's going to have to pay back in some way for doing this to the Capitol. She basically kind of ruined the tradition of what the Hunger Games is meant to be for the people with the war and everything. So basically, he just kind of warns her at first, and Katniss has no idea where this is going, and in some ways, the reader doesn't know where this is going. One thing I will not talk about, but I will say just so you're aware of it, something with Gale is revealed from President Snow, something that Katniss didn't know that President Snow just so happens to know involving Gale. That's all I'm going to say. But basically, something big with Gale happens, and President Snow is more aware of Katniss's life than Katniss thought he was. So basically, it's the 75th annual Hunger Games now. So pretty much it's a year later, and Katniss and Peeta, like I said, they're just kind of celebrating their victory. They're just kind of waiting for what's going to happen next. But the twist of the story, and I guess it's kind of one of the twists of the story. Um, and like I said, I'm going to try to talk about this as spoiler free as possible. Um, there's something at the Hunger Games called the Quarter Quell, and because it's only the 75th Hunger Games, it means it's only the third Quarter Quell. And the Quarter Quell is basically when they announce who the tributes are during the reaping, which is you kind of know where they decide who's going to be in the Hunger Games. Um, Basically, the Quarter Quell adds an additional twist on to that year, and it only happens every 25 years. And because it's the 75th, it's the third time this has happened. From what I remember that Katniss talked about in the book, she said one year there was twice as many tributes was the twist for the I think the first or second quarter Quell, and I think the other twist was either there basically was no age limit. I think 1 year, or basically there was something along that line. Like one I know 1 year they did like twice as many tributes. I think another year either it went on longer or the weather was more harsh than it normally is or something along that line. Or maybe like I think they didn't allow sponsors or something like that 1 year. So it's the third time it's happened, like I said, and basically all I can say, and it's kind of predictable. I know the story centers around Katniss, so something along this line has to happen. But basically, something happens that requires Katniss and Peeta to not exactly do what they just did in the first story, but basically they're challenged in a way that will strongly remind them of the first book, like the actual Hunger Games tournament. So basically, this thing happens without me spoiling anything that involves Katniss and Peeta being put into a really hard situation, and it strongly reminds them of their time in the Hunger Games. So that's about all I can say plot wise. So I really want to get into the positives and negatives, guys, because you know people are kind of going to be kind of anxious, whether the Catching Fire book is better or worse than the first story if you haven't read it yet. For positives, guys, I think it was cool that we got to meet some of the previous tributes from previous years. Um, so basically, like like if whoever won, like Haymitch, for example, from the first story, he won the Hunger Games several years before, while it was happening. In this story, we get to meet more of those winners who have won the Hunger Games in the past, and that was back when there could only be one winner because Katniss and Peeta was the first year where they allowed two winners. So in this one, we do get to learn more about more of those tributes, more of those winners. So I thought that was very interesting. President Snow, I thought, was creepier in this one. He was definitely given more to do in this book, I thought. There's just a lot of things that Suzanne Collins, the author, said about him in this book that made him sound creepier. He did things that were creepier. He's kind of getting inside Katniss's mind more, and I really like that. So I really liked the direction that Suzanne Collins took with President Snow in this book. The quarter quell twist was very neat. Like I said, I'm trying not to spoil it. I'm trying to tell you what it is without spoiling things. But it is a very neat twist. I thought it was kind of a unique way to continue on, the whole Hunger Games idea in a second story. Um, there was more time to get to know Katniss and Peeta, I thought, outside of the games because the 75th annual Hunger Games doesn't start up right away. That gives us more time to get to know Katniss and Peeta. And there's this whole controversy. Are they really in love? Is she in love with Gale? So basically there is kind of this whole Twilight love triangle thing going on a little bit, but it's not so Twilightish that you can't read it kind of thing. But there is kind of this whole deal with Gale and Peeta going on with Katniss. So I thought that was kind of interesting, kind of Suzanne Collins' view of a love triangle. Um, and I thought the book ended on an interesting note. Like I said, not going to spoil it, but if you really research online, you could probably find how the book ends without reading the book. But I did think it ended on a good note. It definitely made me want to say to myself, I got to read Mockingjay now. I got to read that third and final book. As far as negatives go, you guys, I really did not think this was as interesting as book one. Um, and it actually goes off of my other next negative thought, which is there was just a ton of recycled ideas from book one. The fire outfits from when they were presenting who the tributes are for that year were the same. Um, Basically, there was just a lot of the actual Hunger Games, the 75th annual Hunger Games that felt so similar to the 74th one. Um, just a lot of repeated ideas, and I really think Suzanne Collins could have made a better story with new ideas presented in the story. Some parts really dragged out in this one, especially when it's not Katniss and Peeta's character development building before the 75th annual Hunger Games start up again. There's just a lot of scenes where when that's not happening, when the characters aren't developing, just a lot of dead time, a lot of really pointless stuff going on, just a lot of things we already know being repeated again. Um, so I thought all that could have been improved as far as before this book got published. I think Suzanne Collins could have fixed that a little bit. especially telling the story at a quicker pace. I think that definitely could have been improved. And I also think this story takes too long to officially get started. We already know that the story is pretty much going to start where the last book we picked off, and I just really think the story could have benefited, like I said again, if it picked up the pace a little bit. Because I really felt that the first story had such good pacing to it that this one just really did not um, have a reasonable pacing the way the first story did. But overall, guys, I give Catching Fire an 8 out of 10. It is a good book. I personally didn't think it was as good as the actual Hunger Games Part 1 book, though. Um, it'll be interesting to see what they do with the movie because I know Francis Lawrence from I Am Legend is going to direct this one. Gary Ross, I guess, couldn't get the film finished in time if he was attached to it still. So we do have a new director, but it's a good director though, so I'm hoping it'll be good. And I definitely hope they do something with it to really make it better than what the book was. But at the same time, though, there was some things that the Hunger Games movie did that I thought was better than the Hunger Games book. So I'm hoping that's going to be the case with Catching Fire. Also, I really think that if Francis Lawrence gets a hold of the script, he'll be able to make a really interesting um, take on the whole story itself. So, like I said, guys, it's a good book. If you like the first Hunger Games story, it is worth reading. But at the same time, don't expect anything that'll be better than the first book.